Good morning, everyone. We would like to start our fifth Community and Neighborhood Enhancement Advisory Board meeting. It's hard to believe there's been five. This is our fifth one. Thank everyone for being here this morning. One word of warning, if your top button breaks as you're in the parking garage, don't try and tighten your tie so much that you can't feel anything, because then you pass out. Let's see. Call this meeting to order. First item is to approve the minutes from the April 2nd, 2018 meeting.
Move approval.
It's been moved and seconded to approve our minutes from our last meeting. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Thank you. Items for discussion, action. First is street resurfacing projects. Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We actually have one early item this morning is going to be the consider revised arterial street project list. This isn't an item that maybe you were aware, but as we had approved the previous list, as we started to organize the work to be performed, we found that there are actually several projects on that approved list that required some revision, and I'll explain those here in just a minute. We are going to propose that you adopt this new list today. It has mostly the projects that were on it previously, but we've actually added 2 new ones. So what I should say the net total is a net add of 2. There's actually 13 brand new projects on this list and 11 on the old list, which we took off. So let me explain the 11 that were removed. We found that a number of the projects, recalling that this was an arterial street list, they inadvertently were added to the arterial list when actually they are actually considered residential. So there were a couple of locations that were residential. We also had Northwest 16th Street, which is not specifically an arterial. We had South Walker. We learned that ODOT will be performing some of that work as a part of the boulevard, and so there's no need for the city to also do that work as well. We actually had a number of streets, including Northwest 150th Street. There were multiple locations that we're able to advance that work as a part of our internal street maintenance work. So public works street crews were actually able to complete a couple of the projects that were on that previous list. Even though they ranked very high, we sometimes find that there's another method that we can actually complete them. So we were able to remove those, and there were a total of 11 that were removed. We've added 13 new ones, and on your list today, these are going to include all of the projects that begin at project number 29 to the end. So as you look at this list, it's a little bit longer. It doesn't have any more significant of an expense. The total cost on these is $22,120,000, so it still falls within the 60-40 allocation that we had previously considered. And with your consideration and receipt of this list today, this is the list that you'll actually find in the implementation plan that we're going to discuss a little bit later in the agenda. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer those. I think one additional comment that I would have is, as we've mentioned, how we have a very robust GIS system, and it's managing all these projects with PCIs and traffic counts and accident data. And it's just become reality for us in the last year that we've had all of this. We're still taking out a couple of the kinks, and I think this will be some of the last of those as we look at future arterial street lists. As we mentioned in the last meeting for residential, we're also going to be coming back to you with some revised residential options that don't just include the square miles, but hopefully we're going to be able to break that down neighborhood by neighborhood for your consideration in the future as well. So I marked this one up just for an improved list. We obviously got some projects and work that are ready to go, and so, again, happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I'm not for sure I kept up with all that. Sorry.
Okay.
This is so this is not the first set of early projects we approved. This is last month's kind of.
Correct. So there are 16 early start projects that we actually did in that very first 2 meetings. And those projects are approved and underway, and this makes no change to those first 16. Those first 16, if you recall, that had a total value of $18.9 million. No changes to that list. So at the last meeting, we brought to you 2 lists. We were looking at differentiations between, say, a 70-30, 60-40, or a 50-50 split. And this list was presented to you that had projects for just arterial. So we actually have not started these. These haven't been to the City Council yet either, so the original 16 have. So last time we had a total of 39 that were on this list, and this list grew by a total of 2 to 41, which you'll see on this page that's on the screen. So there's a net 2 additional projects, but I'll tell you that 11 of the original list removed, 13 were added. We found 11 locations on the list last month that we were actually able to enhance or expedite very quickly with either county agreements, city crews, or we found that they basically were not arterial. They were on the wrong list. So we've replaced those. So all the ones that are on this list that you see before you, 29 to the end, are the ones that are new. And in the implementation plan, if you want to see a map of those, I did not put those in the presentation, but in your implementation plan, when we get to that part of the meeting, that will be where we officially approve these. We'd like for you to receive the list. This is the list that's in the book today, but these haven't been to council yet. But the geography of these is that they're very well spread out across the city again. There's not a concentration in one area over another.
Okay, sorry, I'm still trying to catch this. So we approved 32 last time.
39.
39. You removed some, so that's why we're only seeing 23 through 41.
So what we've included in here is just a whole new list. The whole new list includes the ones we didn't remove plus the newly added ones. So not all of the projects were taken off the list. We only removed 11 of the original 39. And of the 11, we replaced them with 13. So that's how we're going from 39 to 41. This is page 1.
I see. Okay.
So all of these projects were on the original list. All the way through 28 was on the original list. So 29 is the beginning of the new projects, 29 through 41. And again, these are going through our ranking system, so these were the next series, the next 13, and we've confirmed that these are arterials. We have confirmed that they're eligible, and that's why we're including them for your consideration today. So the action item that we're seeking is to receive this list. Later in the agenda, we'll actually consider having you receive and approve the implementation plan. This list is already in that plan today for your consideration. So you'll actually see this twice today.
Do you need a motion to receive this then, or accept it?
Yes. Yes, we'd like to go ahead and take this one and receive it, and then later we'll do the implementation plan with a separate presentation for you today.
Move to receive the...
Oh, I'm sorry, just a second. Steve, did you have any other questions?
No, sir.
Okay. Any other questions from anyone?
Move to receive the revised list.
Moved and seconded to accept this revived list. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next item is 3B, street enhancement projects.
There are actually no items on the agenda underneath street enhancements.
Thank you. Next, 3C, sidewalk projects.
Yes, good morning, Board. Aubrey McDermott, Planning Director. The next several items on your agenda, we will be presenting the depth of the bike walk plan, which is working its way through the adoption process right now. The Planning Commission's adopted our bike walk OKC plan, and it's on its way to City Council. That planning document, we did kind of a high-level presentation to you to explain the fact that we had worked with the community and established different best practices for identifying the needs across Oklahoma City for sidewalks, bicycle facilities, and trails. So what we're doing with the next several items is we're going to have John Tankard with the Planning Department, who's been the project manager for the Bike Walk OKC plan, take you into the background of the methodology that was used to identify the projects in the Bike Walk OKC plan. And what we're going to be discussing with you today is that the Bike Walk OKC plan has a list of recommended projects that are considered the highest priority projects for funding However, we have a certain amount of funding that we need to allocate. So we're seeking direction at the end of each one of these conversations about how to then take those prioritized projects down to a project-specific recommendation level. So a little more thinking will have to kind of go into how do you pick the projects from the plan that you think are the highest and first ones to be funded with the sales tax. So John will take us through the next couple of sections, and then the last section on trails is actually going to then incorporate more information from the Parks and Recreation Department about our existing trails system, in addition to what the Bike Walk Plan has identified for new trails. So with that, I just wanted to introduce John Tankard, and then we can initiate some conversation and discussion about prioritization.
Thank you all for having me. As Aubrey said, my name is John Tankard with the Planning Department. There's a lot of information that I'm about to go through, so feel free to stop me at any moment with any questions about clarification. We're going to talk about sidewalks first, and so just a little bit of background. You guys saw the presentation last month. For the sidewalk portion of Bike Walk OKC, we realized through the planning process that there are a variety of approaches that make sense in different contexts. So this is a very large city with a lot of different types of urban form, a lot of different levels of residential density, things like that, that led us to what we called component plans in Bike Walk OKC. You got a PDF of the plan, so that's explained in more detail in there. And within the pedestrian plan, there were 5 component plans. I'm going to go through each one and show you how we prioritized projects within those. And if you have any questions along the way, like I said, feel free to speak up. Okay, so as far as identifying the pedestrian priority areas, we did an extensive data analysis in conjunction with public input to look around the city and see where are these areas that are what we wanted to term as eminently walkable. If we put sidewalks, if we put pedestrian infrastructure in these areas, these are the areas that are most likely to become a walkable environment. So we looked at groups of criteria. So on this slide you'll see we looked at design and safety. That included all the sort of infrastructural elements that we have data for. So are there curb ramps? Are there sidewalks? Are there street trees? Things like that. And those are laid out in your prioritization summary. Yeah. We also looked at density. So where are places that people are likely to walk or have people to walk? So places with lots of residential, lots of jobs, lots of activity. And kind of dovetailing with that was more specific land uses, which we looked at as pedestrian demand generation. So these are things that people are likely to walk to. So schools, parks, public transit, trails, grocery stores, sort of daily needs. And then we also looked at responsive populations, which is one of the, or is the number one criteria direction in Plan OKC for planning for sidewalk improvements, responsive populations. So in this case, we looked at people who don't have access to an automobile, people in poverty, residents with disabilities, the elderly, and the young. So this map is actually sort of the overall plan for the pedestrian side of Bike Walk OKC, and you'll see here numbered 1 through 10 are what we settled on as the pedestrian priority areas, and in the plan we go into great detail about them individually, but just to kind of get a feel for what a priority area is, these 10 areas encompass 363 transit stops, 47 schools, 42 parks. They connect to 6 different trails, including the Hefner Trails, Will Rogers, Katy Trail, Grand Boulevard Trail, commercial districts such as Uptown, the Plaza District, SEO, Stockyards, Capitol Hill, and several more. That accounts for more than 40% of supermarkets in the city fall within these areas, and the residential density in these areas is 5 times the rate of the city as a whole. So these areas are prime for pedestrian improvements, but they lack a significant amount of infrastructure. And if you remember the slide from last presentation that kind of showed the donut around the city where sidewalks are missing, these kind of fall into that area. So the next subset of projects is what we're looking at for access to school. So outside of these priority areas, there are still key destinations that people need to walk to and from. Chief among those in a lot of people's minds is schools. And so we wanted to organize them in terms of what the greatest impact would be by investing sidewalk dollars. So we looked at how many people live within a walkable distance of these schools, and we prioritized those schools that had the largest number of people living in the closest radius that we looked at, quarter mile. And then we also grouped the schools by their likelihood to generate pedestrian activity. So public schools that have specific catchment areas were prioritized, and specifically elementary and middle schools, as students are less likely to have, automobiles. So then the next tier would be high schools. Then subsequent to that would be private charter and magnet schools that don't have a defined catchment area, but pull people from around the city. And similarly, colleges and VOTEC. And throughout this planning process, we partnered with the OU College of Public Health as well as the UCO College of Environmental Health, gathering pedestrian data around all of these, or around many of these schools. We haven't gotten through the whole list. There's more than 200 in the city, but we've gotten significantly down the list that we prioritized. This map just kind of shows you the schools around the city with a quarter-mile buffer around them. The red schools are the ones that fall within the pedestrian priority areas. So those have been excluded from the list of prioritized schools, as they are already addressed by other projects. We did a very similar approach to parks, but we didn't group them in the way that we did schools, but we did look at how many people live within a walkable distance of each of these, and we did the same data gathering process. And so the list of parks, as you work your way down it, we've gathered data for a significant chunk of the first 20 or so. And here, again, is parks in the city. The red ones are already covered by pedestrian priority areas. Our third kind of target approach was access to public transit. So we've got access to schools, access to parks, access to public transit. And this one we actually worked with Embark, our transit agency, and came up with criteria to rank their more than 1,300 bus stops around the city to kind of determine which ones were the highest priority. So these are all the criteria that we looked at. We used kind of the standard measure of who's using the system now with boarding and alighting, which is people getting on and off at a specific bus stop. And then we looked at those bus stops in terms of what they're close to. What can we connect people to if we put sidewalks around these bus stops? And we weighted everything equally. And so we arrived at 20 what we deemed transit priority locations that we worked through with Embark, and they agreed on these locations. And these are places that had high levels of ridership, had high rates of proximity to things that people might take the bus to, and areas that lack pedestrian infrastructure presently. So you can kind of see how these parks, schools, and transit locations start to fill in these gaps around the pedestrian priority areas. So we get a more broad approach in the PPAs and a more targeted approach outside of them. The last group of projects is for downtown. So downtown is ostensibly the most walkable place in the city, and there's a lot of different user groups in downtown who would benefit from walkability, whether it's employees, residents, transit users, or tourists, all sorts of different groups. And so we looked at every street segment in downtown and determined, are the sidewalks accessible, basically. And so we looked at, we grouped them into both sides are inaccessible, one side is inaccessible, or both sides are accessible. And that just gave us a picture of the city like this. So red on this map shows segments of street that are, both sides are inaccessible, and that could either be that the sidewalk is completely missing, or maybe at the alley mid-block there are no ramps. So we're really thinking about the infrastructural elements that make a downtown truly walkable for all user groups. Yellow means that they are impassable on one side, and then if they have no color, that means that they were good on both sides. So let me go back. So we then, in order to prioritize these projects further, or in order to prioritize them at all, we decided, there's a high likelihood that a lot of these will get built by new development as is. Downtown's growing, and as a requirement of building something, you have to include a sidewalk with that. But there are certain areas of the downtown that are developing more slowly than others that we thought could raise its priority. So we looked at segments around some key locations, including the rescue mission, Emerson School, St. Anthony's, but then also the new streetcar route. We want to make sure that as that comes in, walkability to and from the streetcar is facilitated. That's a key component of it. And then Classen Boulevard as well has received quite a bit of money through the GEO bond, and so we wanted to make sure that getting people to and from Classen was prioritized. So that's a lot. It's a complex item, but sidewalks in a city this size, require different approaches for different areas. So with that, this just kind of summarizes our recommendations for how to distribute funds. So this is something that can be discussed among, the board and determine if you agree with these percentages. If not, you can modify them. But this just gives you a framework of what the Bike Walk OKC recommends, which is slightly more than half going into these pedestrian priority areas to get them to that walkable state. In the GEO bond vote that occurred, we had something like 70% of Phase 1 get funded, so this committee could vote to complete Phase 1 and move into Phase 2 in these areas. And then also we show some breakdowns for schools, parks, transit, and downtown. And there are other funding sources available, such as Safe Routes to School funding through the federal government that could help to leverage these dollars so that 15% for schools at $3.6 million could be leveraged upward.
John, let me interrupt you just a second. Can you go back one?
Yes.
For our Community Neighborhood Enhancement Advisory Board, $8 million is going to come to sidewalks. Is that correct?
24.
24.
Mm-hmm.
That's not including the GEO bond money.
Correct.
Okay. So what we're talking is over our period of time that we have 24 for sidewalks.
That's correct.
Very good.
And I wanted to pop back up here to, if John could stay too, to help talk through some of these considerations, because the Bike Walk plan has identified a number of sidewalk projects that the Bike Walk OKC plan views as of equal priority. For example, the pedestrian priority areas in the plan, there are 5 of them, all of equal priority, and then all of those projects outside of those pedestrian priority areas. So with the $24 million that's available for sidewalks, we would like for this board to provide some direction on how you'd like to see the project lists sorted further. What you received in your packets is a project list of all the unfunded projects from the Bike Walk plan, and these are ranked by the methodology that John just explained for the Bike Walk OKC document. So within these project lists, if this board felt like the percentages of project types needed to be allocated, for example, if you wanted to consider having a percentage of funds go to each of those categories so that you could see sidewalks built in the pedestrian priority areas, around schools, around transit stops, in downtown, you could think about taking the $24 million and breaking it down and then just going down the prioritized list as Bike Walk OKC has recommended. Another thing, if you could turn it back to the considerations here, within these different categories, if you'd like to see sidewalks distributed geographically around the city, we could look at this in a geographic setting so that you get a certain number of schools prioritized that are within each district or ward within the city. You may think that the pedestrian priority areas themselves are some of the highest need, and if we are funding a portion of those with the bond, to go ahead and complete the sidewalks in that by moving those projects up to the top of the list. So these are just some initial considerations that we wanted to suggest, and if there are any other considerations about further prioritization, what we'd like to get to is one of those project methodology worksheets. So John, if you could just flip to the next slide real quick. You'll recognize these. We've been developing these worksheets for each project category that we've done so far. This is just an example of something that we would put together for the sidewalk network. We basically populated this with what the Bike Walk OKC plan has already done in terms of methodology. But if you want to add initial considerations about distribution of funds by category or other criteria, we would like to get direction to capture that, to bring back next time, and we could resort lists so that we could really start to see how far that $24 million could go. So with that, I'd like to just open it up for discussion and answer any questions you might have, too, with John.
Aubrey, I've had the pleasure of serving on the privilege, of the MAPS 3 subcommittee for trails and sidewalks. And there was no map that even existed in Oklahoma City for sidewalks. Sidewalks hadn't been built since the 60s, basically, as far as the city goes. Some developers had done some small-scale stuff. One, the priority was definitely on access to schools and went far ahead from what used to be. I would think there would also be, there's got to be some information as far as what that subcommittee had come up with as far as future sidewalks. Did you all incorporate that into your all's new plan?
Yes, we did. Yeah, we looked at the plan that, or the list of projects, and those are largely incorporated into these destination-based things. Like you said, it was looking at access to schools, and so with that being its own category, we, brought that concept in, not just on arterial streets this time, but also into the neighborhoods themselves.
Very good.
Several of the previous plans that have been developed for this city were rolled into this plan. So the previous Trails Master Plan, and then the MAPS 3 Sidewalks and Trails recommendations from the original study.
The 2008 Bicycle Transportation Plan and the bicycle and pedestrian components of the Downtown Development Framework.
We had several sources that we could go to look for studies and background information that we wanted to consolidate and have one document that captured all of that, and that's what the result of this document would be.
Thank you.
Yeah, so all of it's in one place now, so, yeah.
Good.
So, John, if you might want to go back to the previous slide just to give us some prompts for discussion.
So I did have one question. I would want to make sure I'm understanding everything that's before us, and I haven't had a chance to read the Bike Walk OKC plan yet, so some of the information might be included there. But the list that we have provided, so I understand the downtown list, and I understand the emphasis on that. But these other prioritization lists or the rankings, can you help me understand what the sort of purpose of those are in the context of I guess, giving you feedback on methodology, et cetera? Is there, so like with the downtown sidewalks, kind of clear what those projects look like. Is there any similar type of idea, whether we're talking about priority project areas, et cetera? I guess I'm kind of curious where the actual sidewalks would go.
Yeah. So for the pedestrian priority areas, those are laid out with the location description that tells you exactly the roads between where and where they would go, or in an area bounded by. That might be the language that's used, and that's language that we used in the GEO bond. So this is, these have been pretty well defined. The schools and parks are less defined at this point. We didn't feel that we, through the planning process, that we had really the capacity or time to go and identify all the missing sidewalks. So that's sort of what I was referring to, that we partnered with OU and UCO to go out and start gathering that data. And basically, the list of parks and schools that you see, unless you have some other criteria you'd like us to consider, we would work our way down that list. If there's other criteria, we would shuffle those around based on that. So our recommendation is to spend enough money to fund about a mile of, just rule of thumb, a mile of sidewalk per park or school or transit priority area, which would be about $350 per, or $350,000 per project. And that's just a kind of manageable amount that allows you to, do projects in a variety of different areas. This right here we showed 10 to 15 schools, 8 to 10 parks, 8 to 10 transit connections. Yeah.
And so, all right, so I think I understand. So what you're saying is, if I'm looking at the school list, for example, then this would presume that there are sidewalks, I mean, in the environment or the surrounding area to the school?
This would give us the I can tell you, based on the investigation we've done on like the highest priority, that there's a lot of sidewalks missing. So the school itself might have a sidewalk around its block, but getting to and from that, there's going to be gaps that we would come in and fill in.
Okay. So, I think I'm trying to get someplace, because this is actually what I've gotten the most feedback from citizens about, actually. So I think the information that's here doesn't necessarily answer my question, but I could speak in a specific term. Like, there's an elementary school, Thelma Parks at 30th and Prospect, and so there are several missing sidewalks. We regularly have kids crossing fields to get there. So what I'm not clear from looking at this is if that project gets done, and if so, where it is in the list here. So that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out. And also knowing that some of these things were maybe put forward in the bond issue, so I'm never really clear on projects in the bond versus what's being presented here as well.
So if you look on this list, there's an asterisk by number 17, James L. Dennis. That's the only one that got any funding in the bond based on the prioritization there. This was just our approach to this was just looking at the number of people that live within a certain distance of these areas. So so wherever the project falls on this list, that's how it ranks based on how many people live in proximity to it. So if there are certain schools that have a higher need based on other criteria, that would be something that we could, redo this list based on.
Yeah, and like I say, I'm not trying to be, that's just one that I know specifically.
Yeah.
I know that particular use case, so what I'm trying to figure out is how I would be able to sort of connect that to what's here, to know that, those projects are included, or at least even the priority. And I guess what I'm saying for you guys is not clear to me by looking at this, that I would be able to tell like that project is on a list or prioritized or not.
Okay.
I actually not sure. I'm not even sure if I see that school here. So.
And it is called Delmar what?
Thelma R. Parks Elementary School.
Well, and can I add something now? So I'm understanding these schools and these parks, I mean, the main goal is to get sidewalks that connect the residential to that area.
That's
and
correct.
so I'm thinking as we continue to move forward, once we approve this, will we get more details at that point?
Absolutely.
Okay, so
Yes.
we'll get exact.
Yeah, thanks. So that might be the answer.
Yeah. So the
okay.
parks and schools are fairly unique in these. The other ones are a little more defined, these, because each one is going to be a fairly in-depth analysis. We have not jumped into that yet because there's so many, and based on feedback from this committee, we may have to, or the lists may change, so we didn't want to go ahead and do all that work when we could get your feedback and then move from there.
John, the priority areas include schools and parks, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Like I said, it's 47 schools and 42 parks within those 10 areas. Yep.
Say that again, 47
47 schools, 42 parks
in the two priority areas.
in the 10 areas, yes.
Okay.
And that's 363 transit stops as well.
I have a question.
Yes.
It's a little backhanded question.
Okay.
That we've been building sidewalks now for several years. I think my first part of the question was, how do we analyze actually need or use? The second is, have we developed a criteria about things that we thought would be a good idea and weren't, as far as building sidewalks that no one used? I think this is a question that will come later from people in the group.
I think it's a valid question. Could you repeat the first part?
Well, I didn't. It's kind of like when you're working on a street, you put down something to count the number of cars. Right. We don't really. I don't know how you evaluate the number of people who walk on the grass now, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, so it's a challenge because the streets, the infrastructure exists. The sidewalks do not, largely. And so counting pedestrians where infrastructure doesn't exist is maybe getting ahead of the situation. So we really are thinking more about things we can count. We know that we have transit riders. We know that based on the public feedback during the plan where we had more than 1,700 responses to our survey, we did tons of meetings, parks and schools, transit, walkable neighborhoods were things that people wanted. And so we then dove into land uses that people might walk to. So the parks, the schools, the transit stops, grocery stores, commercial districts. We also considered the Americans with Disabilities Act and what is the prioritization under that, which includes government facilities. So we looked at that. We looked at multifamily housing, where there's likely to be more people who may be lower income, who are more likely to rely on walking for transportation. So that's sort of all the things that we kind of baked into our prioritization for those priority areas. And as far as criteria that have not worked, I'm not sure that we have
It's
run
a
into
question I from time to time have asked, because people in outlying areas sometimes see sidewalks that have been built and ask the question, I never see anyone on those sidewalks.
Right.
And I think that's a question that's going to come from the citizens in the room at some point in time.
Sure.
So that's why I ask it now.
Well, it's a valid question. I think when you put it that way, we looked at density as well. So the density in terms of how many people live in an area is pretty directly tied to how likely people are going to walk. If you're at the very edge of a city adjacent to rural areas where there's nothing within walking distance, yeah, building a sidewalk out there is less likely to generate pedestrian activity than if you built it in the inner city where it's missing.
Thank you.
John?
Yes.
I would think it would help for this committee to see what sidewalks have been built with MAPS 3 money. There's some sidewalks around that have also been built with some of the GO monies from 2007, I believe.
Yes.
If we could see what has been done in the last, say, 10 years, I think MAPS 3 has pretty well spent their budget on sidewalks. There may be a little bit work that's still being done, but they're going to have an updated map, which I think, that group had the priority of building sidewalks to schools, but there's still a lot of that to be done.
Yeah, there were 5 or 6 different criteria for the MAPS projects, and they are in Bike Walk OKC, so all of you have that PDF if you actually turned right to it. But, there is a map that shows everything that was built in the 07 GEO bond, the MAPS 3, and Project 180. So those are included in the document if you'd like to see that. That's page 65.
Second question, is it possible for you guys to do like with street resurfacing? Initially in our first meeting, we were able to look at the top priority of what streets needed to be done. That was the $18.9 million to be spent there. Do you all have like the most immediate need from your all's department?
Well, so we decided that we wanted to, because it's really hard to say that this one segment is more important than another in the inner city where sidewalks are missing or resurfacing. The infrastructure's there, so it's really just about enhancing it. This is about creating new infrastructure, and there the pedestrian priority areas are really equal in our mind in terms of priority, and there's a list of projects that if you have specific direction that you as a committee want to take it, we would go that direction. But from our perspective, completing phase 1 of the pedestrian priority areas makes sense. All these areas are equally likely to become walkable neighborhoods if you spend the money there. And then, as I said, it was broken into these 5 component plans, all of which are prioritized differently. So I think it'd be comparing apples to oranges if we tried to make one list of sidewalk projects like that.
Couple of questions. Can you pull up the map with the 10 priorities, please?
Yes.
And you mentioned the priority areas, phase 1 projects. So if all those project 1s were put on the front burner, what's the guesstimate price of those 3? 1, 2, 3, 4 project 1s? Any guesses on how much that would run us?
Yes. We estimate it to be right under $10 million.
That alone would be $10 million.
Correct. And if you look at this slide right here, So Phase 1 improvements, the remainder would be right under 10 million. And if we did this 60% towards the PPAs, that would leave an additional 4.5 million that could be distributed through Phase 2 projects based on this committee's discretion, and then the rest distributed as such.
The current, Mr. Thompson mentioned some school issues. Would that be under the current dollars, under the 3.6?
Yes, in addition to the 47 that are already within the pedestrian priority areas. So that would be opportunity to do 10 to 15 schools outside of the 47 that could also be addressed. So that could get it up to more than 50 schools.
And again, if you feel like that we need to look at geographic distribution around the city of those school sites, that could be some additional criteria we could sort the list by, which I think may be important.
And you guys said planning, the planning council approved this. When did they?
Planning Commission adopted the plan,
Okay.
I think 2 weeks ago.
Okay. And city council, when did they hear that?
At the end of May, I think the 22nd, it's scheduled to go before council.
So this is fairly complicated. It's a holistic approach to sidewalk planning that looks at different contexts and really starts to try to break it down, with the idea that different places of the city have different needs, different groups of people have different needs, and this approach kind of, recommends splitting the funding based on that.
So this will be a similar question that we ask the board for each one of these categories that we're getting ready to present to you on the bicycle facilities and trails, kind of the same types of questions. If you'd like to allocate a percentage of funds to different project types, if you'd like to look more geographically, these are the things that we could then start to resort these lists by. Any other type of analysis, like Mr. Thompson recommended, looking at schools and gaps in the sidewalk system to schools, we would like to receive your direction on that so we could take back the lists and resort.
Yeah, I would say as a comment, maybe more than a question. I understand the priority areas, and I think that is pretty clear. I think it's hard to really make a good judgment or analysis on the remaining because this is not quite clear, and I think this is preliminary for you all too. So it sounds like there's more information to be had before sort of the specific, I guess, projects or the specific elements are chosen. But the priority area seems pretty clear, and it seems like it's pretty decent mix as far as where you would expect there to be sidewalk needs throughout the city. It's harder for me to figure out how we should be prioritizing and thinking about the connections outside of the PPAs, because I'm not sure that I can see clearly what that looks like versus what's in there.
And those were weighted pretty similarly to each other because they were just based on the population density around those destination sites. Knowing that there's gaps in infrastructure, some might have more gaps in infrastructure than others, but we were just wanting to get those sites identified so that we can start to go in and do more specific assessments.
Yeah, and so they were prioritized based on impact, with the understanding that the more people there are within a walkable distance, the more people would be impacted by sidewalk improvements. So if there's, like Aubrey said, if there's geographic distribution or percentage of sidewalks missing within a walkable distance, something like that, those are criteria that we could take back and then kind of see how the schools and parks shake out from there.
I'm thinking that the geographic might be a great way to go, because I think it's all about visualizing. This is a huge amount of information.
Yes.
And the clearer we can see what we're doing, that's the better for everyone.
Sounds good. Are there any other kind of major considerations we should look at?
Well, and when we do get the exact locations of where these sidewalks will go, what flexibility do we have to add, maybe if there is a sidewalk that is not included in that list, do we have flexibility to add or remove
The way that we were hoping to do all of the project lists is that we wouldn't approve a holistic list at one time, but that we can resort lists based on the criteria. So as projects are identified, we add them to the database to see if those raise to the top of the priority. And about every 6 months, we can get enough projects forwarded to council for funding and come back and revisit that list after those projects have been done. So take it piece by piece. And that allows us the flexibility to receive information from the community, or if there's a special project that comes up, put it back into the pot for further sorting and consideration.
Very good.
So I'm hearing geographic distribution might be an important factor to think about for those sidewalk, school, transit, parks connections. Any thoughts or directions about the allocation of funds between categories, if you would consider or make a recommendation to consider appropriating a certain percent of the budget towards any one of these categories? Or do you want to just receive some new information next time and have a month to think about it?
So what does the committee think about that question?
I'm probably a fan of time.
Okay. What we can do is go back and look at how many projects might fall equally across the city outside of the pedestrian priority areas, see what information we might already have about gaps in the sidewalk system to connect neighborhoods to schools, so that we can see the number of projects that may be critical to raise to the top of the list. And if you all, in the meantime, want to start thinking about what you think might be priorities within these categories or among the categories, we can continue the discussion and come up with some criteria that we can then solidify.
Good. According to this graph, 60% of the money would go to the 10 pedestrian priority areas. But we've had a lot of discussion about schools, which on this graph only have 15%. What I'm hearing is there's a number of folks that think schools should have a higher priority.
I do think it's a bit misleading, because that's what my question was. Within the first phase and second phase, 47 schools are included, 42 parks are included, 363 transit stops. Is that correct?
Yes. The pedestrian priority areas include a higher density of schools.
And that's why I think it's a bit confusing.
Yep.
So looking at phase 1 and phase 2, those also include all of the other components. They're just not listed out.
That's correct.
That would help to see that.
Okay. That's in the plan. Each pedestrian priority area has a map that shows all the parks and schools and transit routes that go through them. So if you look in the pedestrian chapter of the plan, you can really kind of get a deep dive into each of these areas.
This in the Bike Walk OKC plan?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's probably been just more time. I mean, I think I got a link to that probably last week, but hadn't had a chance to digest it. So that might, frankly, answer some of the questions. And if I'm hearing you, I mean, now today talking about trying to take a comprehensive approach, then, I mean, I guess we can assume that, all the needs in an area would get covered if we're saying that we're going to do all the sidewalks in that area. And then I guess we'll just have to see what comes up on the implementation side.
And the projects within those PPAs are strategic. It's not just blanket do every sidewalk. It's do sidewalks along the major corridors first, the commercial corridors, transit corridors, things like that. And then phase 2 is really connecting those neighborhoods to those primary corridors.
Yeah, and I would just say, as an aside, to help with how I got off track, I mean, I think just knowing actual physical locations, so I think there are several schools, for example, that are in the list and also in the project plan, but then there are some that are missing. So that's something that
It's possible if it's not in this list, it's probably in a PPA.
Yeah,
that's
yeah. Well, so what I'm saying is I'm seeing both, so just kind of create a little bit of inconsistency for me. But I think through the conversation, I'm kind of clear on it now.
I think this is good discussion for you to keep in mind as you go review the bike walk plan further. Just to think about the $24 million that we have to use to build sidewalks across Oklahoma City. And when we come back next month, after we've had time to digest that and we've had time to look at geographic distribution. Then we'd like to get your direction on how to further prioritize projects and percentages of funds. And John would then, on the next segment on the agenda, would also take you through the same background about Bike Walk OKC and how the bicycle facilities have been identified. Are you ready to move on to that?
Are we all good on this at this point?
It's less complicated, so.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So the bicycle plan, so one of the major things we learned through Bike Walk OKC is just how different bicycle and pedestrian planning are. Pedestrian planning, again, has all these different contexts, and while that's applicable to bicycle planning, it's much more aligned with how you get around as you would in an automobile. You know, it's using the street network. It's about getting from A to B. And so through the public engagement process and through the survey, through many different, absorptions of the 2008 plan, just different things, we arrived at numerous projects and we prioritized them based on, well, let me slow down. This is the existing facilities in Oklahoma City. The green is actually trail, purple is what are called bike routes, and yellow is bike lanes. So we only have about 7 miles of bike lane where we have well over 50 miles of bicycle routes. Those are just signed on-street facilities that may have a sharrow. That's the arrow with the bicycle behind it that tells you that this is a place where cyclists may be riding. And then Bike Walk OKC calls for this being our total network, and I'm going to just quickly kind of explain some aspects of it and then show you the prioritization. So in order to identify the type of facility that's appropriate on each road, we considered the interaction with automobiles as a major aspect of it, in addition to getting from one place to another. So we looked at automobile speed, automobile traffic volume, as well as the existing space from curb to curb, and put that into this matrix that tells us what the right type of facility is for each street, and use that to kind of create a network. And I will say that any project that we go out in the field and start doing engineering and design work, that may be modified, but this was just sort of our preliminary attempt to determine what level of safety requirement was necessary so that cyclists of all types, whether it's me or my wife or my mom, feel comfortable going out on the street riding their bike for transportation. So this is a map of the inner city, just kind of how that played out. So we rated these in terms of, on a tier system, in terms of how much safety needs to be introduced for the cyclist to have a comfortable ride. So that's tier 1, 2, and 3. So that plays into all of these projects. In terms of determining which project goes first, we looked at these criteria. So we looked at sort of bang for your buck numbers, how many people live within a bicycle or within a close proximity of these proposed facilities, just using a rough cost estimate, what would the cost per resident be? That's the bang for your buck number. And then connections to things like schools, parks, commercial districts. One of the key things that came up through the public input phase was that people feel like there are major barriers, physical barriers to riding their bike. So if I'm riding along 19th Street and I get to May Avenue, that's a barrier. That's not comfortable to cross. It's high speed, high traffic. So that's something that keeps people from moving across it. The river, the interstates, things that need bridges also kind of fall in that category. And then within the plan, just like the pedestrian plan, we have what we call component plans. And so these just kind of bigger projects that these smaller projects fit into that accomplish a bigger goal, whether that's completing the Grand Boulevard loop to make it so that we kind of reconnect that for active transportation, or our crosstown connections, which is the idea of having an east-west and north-south spine. If these projects came into that, we gave them higher priority. So this map just kind of illustrates the location of these priority projects. Priority 1 is already funded, either through the GEO bond or through federal grants. So what we're bringing to you today is the list of priority 2 and priority 3 projects. So you'll see that attached to your prioritization summary document. And we also have, how these scored based on the different criteria. So that's really where we're at. We wanted to basically allow this committee to take these priority 2 and 3 projects and pick what makes sense based on your interactions with, people in your wards, the people, or, between yourselves. But as you can see, these all kind of build off of each other, off of the priority 1, and that's a key goal of this plan, is that as we build the network, it's connected. We're not building segments of bicycle infrastructure that don't connect from or to the broader network. So.
Here's the fun part of our conversation again. Just asking the same questions before based on the recommendations in the Bike Walk plan, moving those priority projects up through a process that we could start to choose projects to be funded. Again, we could look at projects geographically distributed. We could look at the funding of one or more of those different component plan types that John walked through. We could also look at trying to connect. Bike Walk OKC itself does look at trying to connect larger systems together. But with the bond-funded projects and other grant-funded projects, if we could also look at trying to create a larger project by filling in the gaps with the bicycle network with those projects and creating that synergy between them, that could be another sorting factor for these. So I'd just like to open it up again for your direction and discussion.
Aubrey, how many dollars are involved in this?
This is a $12 million bucket.
Which includes any trail improvements or any new trails?
The trail budget itself has $12 million. The bicycle facilities is another $12 million, although some bicycle facilities are trails. So there's some crossover between the two lists.
So each one has 12
Yes.
million. Thank you.
Could you explain the component part?
Yes.
I was unclear on that.
So in order to add some logic to prioritizing the network, we grouped projects into what we called component plans that seek to accomplish a broader goal than each individual project within it could do. So I mentioned the Grand Boulevard Loop. So historically that was originally built as a loop around the city that was then disconnected by interstates that were built along them. So there are gaps that we can close through this funding stream, these bicycle projects that we've identified in the plan that would, rather than having it rank against each project, it may be a small gap that we need to fill, but it has large implications for how people get around on bikes in Oklahoma City. So that's really, each component plan has that aspect to it. Does that make sense?
You might want to just name those, kind of brief description of each.
Yes, so we have the Grand Boulevard Loop, we have crosstown connections, that's that east-west, north-south spine. We have neighborhood greenways, and these are getting more into, this is a bicycle and trails plan. This funding is a little more separated than the plan is. Neighborhood greenways, we have regional recreational trails, so that's trails that could connect Oklahoma City better to surrounding cities such as Edmond or Midwest City. We have bicycle and pedestrian bridges, and so this is kind of the targeted approach at crossing major barriers that were identified in the plan. And then, those are the primary component plans, and then we have sort of the everything else component plan that just kind of captures those projects that don't fit into those first component plans.
John, I'm sorry. I feel like you need to fill in the gap for me real quick. Under component plan, we have 150 and 0. What does that represent?
So we gave 50 points for each component plan that each project contributes to. So if it's 100, that means it contributed to 2 of those. If it was 50, that's 1. If it's 0, it didn't fall into any of them. Yep. And so, as I mentioned, the crosstown connections one, that was largely funded already through the GO bond, so that gives us kind of a framework to start building off of. Yep.
So can you describe what these enhancements will look like, or what the bicycle infrastructure will look like. And I know you had the three different sort of approaches, but so if we're looking at these lists, I get that it could be a combination of these three options. So does that look like as a street is perhaps being resurfaced, or are these streets getting rebuilt with bike lanes and things of that nature where it's deemed appropriate?
There is some overlap between bond project resurfacing, or we'll need to look at the list for this funding stream. But there is some overlap, but that was not kind of baked into this prioritization.
So it could be a combination of both. Where the right-of-way exists and conditions exist to put the bicycle infrastructure in, it could be a restriping project to accommodate the safest level of facility based on this type of analysis for any given area. So the plan is identifying the areas of need and then the appropriate facility type. So it could be done as part of a resurfacing project, or it could be done on an existing street.
At what point do you think that you would be able to connect the facility type to the areas where the bike facility is being done?
Well, we have the preliminaries for all the projects already, so that would be where we would start.
Is that in the plan too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And for each project, we have sort of detailed sheets that we can give you that go into it and zoom in. It has its own specific map, and so yeah, we have a lot of detail. This is
You could have just said you need to read the plan.
So, 3 years of work. Yeah, it's hard to condense it down into just 30 minutes. Yeah.
The preliminary facility type, though, is really based on those generalized things: traffic, speed, volume, and safety conditions. But as John said, these also are going to require a level of engineering detail and specific site analysis. So even though that might be identified as a Tier 2 facility, the whole segment of that roadway may not be built out as a protected bike lane. There may be portions of that roadway that have to be an on-street shared bike lane.
Right. That's exactly right.
So again, if you wanted to offer some direction to resort any of these lists that you've seen presented in your packet today, or any other background from the Bike Walk OKC plan, we could be working on that between now and then. Ultimately, what we want to get to is this type of criteria sheet with specific criteria we could then use as facilities come in to make recommendations on projects to fund.
Any other comments?
Just to get a ballpark, when we talk about visual, so priority 2 list, what kind of cost are we talking?
So the best practices for, it depends on the type of facility you're doing. And if there's a resurfacing, that's going to make it significantly more expensive. But if it's just paint and additional, maybe bollards to separate the bike lane, like on the new Will Rogers Trail, for example, I mean, a protected bike lane could go for $80,000 per mile plus. A standard bike lane would be significantly less expensive. And then bicycle routes, it's really going to depend on the context. If speed is an issue, there are different techniques that we can use that cost a variety of dollars. But I will say, by and large, on-street bicycle facilities are substantially cheaper than separated trail facilities that, are basically start from scratch. They're basically small roads that you're building.
I had a question.
Yes.
It seems to me, and it was earlier brought up, barriers are a huge part of this. Like you say, May Avenue, and I asked him early on, how does the trail connect going across Northwest Highway? And obviously that's a huge investment in whatever you would do there. But it would seem to me like that would be a high priority just to deal with the barrier situation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Because you can, my wife would drive to the street and say, well, the hell with this, and turn around and go back.
Right. Mine as well.
And again, if you want to take some time to review the plan and think about how you might allocate funds between the different categories, as John mentioned, there are those 5 different component plans. One of the component plans is the bridges and the removal of barriers. If those component plans feel like they need a different amount of money to be funded to them, or a different prioritization as we start to build the implementation plan and start to select projects moving forward, then that is a methodology that we would like to hear from you back next month. I'm assuming that you'll want to take another month on this item as well. Okay.
I would recommend it. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
One more to go. So we're going to talk about trails now. I'm going to talk about the plan for new facilities, and then the Parks Department will talk to you about potentially or projects for existing trails, so enhancing existing trails. So as far as new trails and greenways, and I'm going to go ahead and explain the difference here. In certain areas of the city where there really isn't any opportunity to do on-street bicycle facilities due to urban form. So when you get out to the suburban areas, we really have two types of road. We have major arterials, and then we have neighborhood streets that often don't connect through the neighborhoods. So doing bicycle infrastructure is extremely disruptive on street because pretty much all the traffic is on one type of road, the major arterial. So in those areas, we've identified what we refer to as riparian corridors. So that's water bodies that go through this area that give us an opportunity to do greenways, which may be the only way to get bicycle infrastructure into these types of areas at all. So that's just something that we kind of built into the plan because we wanted to make sure that suburban areas of the city were not being left out when it came to active transportation and recreation infrastructure. So with that said, trails are just what we have built everywhere. So Will Rogers Trail, the river trails, that's what you should visualize there. Greenways could be built the same way. They could be built narrower. They could be built with a different material type like this. We did research on accessibility, ADA, things like that, and these do comply with ADA so long as they meet standards for stability and firmness, which are quantifiable. So there's quite a bit of flexibility in the design of these facilities, but this is how we prioritize where new ones should go. So again, looking at sort of bang for your buck numbers, how many people live close to them, and the cost per household based on that. Does it connect to the existing trail network? If so, that's a higher priority. We looked at topography and constructability. So the hillier something is, the more difficult it's going to be when we get out there in the field to build it. And then we looked at property ownership. So purchasing right-of-way is a big deal. It can be quite expensive and take quite a bit of time. So the fewer property owners there were, the higher priority the project was. And then there are some projects in the plan that are in areas of the city that are currently undeveloped, and portions of those could be constructed as a part of new development that occurs in those areas. So we wanted to, if that were the case, if there was a lot of instances where we think private development would build it, that lowered the priority of the project. So this map is the 46 projects that are on your list. And, it takes into account all those criteria, and it's on a color gradient of red being the highest priority to blue being the lowest. And what you'll notice actually is that just kind of naturally by that criteria, we see a pretty good geographic distribution of high priority projects. That just worked out with the data, so that made us pretty confident that this was a good way for us to go forward on that. So if that's something we want to, I'll go back to that. If that's something that we want to add to the criteria is this sort of geographic distribution, that's something that could be accomplished pretty easily. I'll just point out that Lake Hefner, upgrading that was a high priority. On your list, what you don't see here is the Deep Fork Trail alignment. So that's one that has been in the works since at least the 07 bond and is in design and moving forward presently, and there's a gap that needs to be closed to complete that. Finishing that project will connect the Katy Trail to the Nichols Hills Trail, and I'll get you more information on that one specifically.
So again, the projects recommended in Bike Walk OKC primarily are new trails and new greenways. And perhaps the discussion about if you want to recommend allocating funds between different types of trail projects, you may want to have that discussion after you hear from the Parks and Recreation Director, Doug Kupper, because he's going to walk you through what needs exist on the current existing trail system. The new trails and new greenways, as you start to think through how to distribute that $12 million in the trails funding, you could think about allocating between trails, greenways, and existing trails. So with that, I think it might be a good time to answer questions about the Bike Walk OKC Trails recommendations. And then if After that, then Doug Cupper will take the trails conversation further.
I'd like to comment that once the trail around Draper Lake is complete, that will be the third and final MAPS 3 trail, and that will give us a little over 100 miles of multi-use trail around Oklahoma City. And one of the things we continue to talk about, the dialogue has been, is connectivity of those trails, priority, and maintenance of those. But we've come a long way in a pretty short period of time for this city, and the trails are very well used, and certainly a strong statement in health and welfare.
Absolutely. And there's just small gaps that we could fill to really connect that whole network even better than it is presently. Yeah.
Very good.
If you have any other questions for us, we'd be happy to answer them. And if not, we can move on.
I've got one.
Okay.
So if I just want to make sure I'm kind of understanding this one correctly too. So this is the $12 million for trails here is really something that we have to look at between this list, which is kind of the bike walk sort of generated list of new items. So we had to weigh that against the existing.
Correct.
As well, and then kind of figure out between those two how we want to.
Exactly. Okay, so you're ready?
One last question, and I'm assuming based on the other answers that we're not sure, but do we have a cost idea for this? Seems like this might be a little bit more straightforward. Do we have a cost idea for what's presented here?
I mean, yeah, we use, as a rule of thumb, we use 1.1 million per mile for those facilities. So I believe, well, in the plan for sure, it's got the number of miles, so you could just multiply that out.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Any other comments? Thank you all.
Okay. Doug Cupper, your Director of Parks, Recreation, and Trails. Added that one in. Thank you, Aubrey. John, appreciate the work you've done. I don't know how to really start this off. Aubrey is cringing because she knows I don't usually work from a script. So I'll just jump into it. We have, and again, this number is variable. Some of our documents say we already have 90 miles. Some of our records show that we already have 80 miles. Mr. McKnight was correct. When the 13 miles around Stanley Draper gets created, finally, we will be right at 100 miles of off-road multi-purpose trails within our city limits. Some of the things, the trails currently are made out of asphalt mat, reinforced concrete, or in some cases stabilized natural soil. We don't have very many of those. Most of our multi-use trails are some kind of pavement, concrete or asphalt. Some of the things that we have heard from our citizens over the years is safety through signage. What's the proper etiquette? If you're a walker, where should you walk on our multi-purpose trails? If you're a biker, how do you pass pedestrians on our multi-purpose trails? So wayfinding signs, signage, etiquette signage. If you're on the West River Trail, how far is it to Dell or the next set of restrooms or the next parking lot where you can get out and call an Uber to take you back because you overestimated your capacity to do a bicycle trip. So wayfinding and signage, it all comes into safety. We've had a lot of issues over the last few years that people are maybe falling off their bikes, and we'll get into reasons why they're falling off their bikes. Where are they? How do they know where they're at on our trail system to call for assistance? So again, wayfinding and signage. A lot of activities on our trail. Obviously, the more we build, the more we get usages out of it. Restrooms, amenities such as that is playing into a key part of the trail system. lighting, for extended use of our trails. A lot of our trails are actually now being used as alternative transportation. And as we look through our budget processes and we add nighttime bus services or weekend bus services, can they use this alternative transportation mode from a lighting perspective? Is it safe to use sections of the trail where people may want to get an early start to get to work? And again, landscaping is one of those things that we want to try to figure out how to improve the quality of the experience that we go through. So what we're going to try to do is walk through a little bit of our analyzing, try to figure out what makes sense to y'all from a funding perspective. How do we break down that $12 million that we have to spend on off-road trail systems? I also want to, as we look at the existing map of our existing system, the green ones are the done trails, the completed trails. The red are either under construction as we speak or under design. The red at the bottom right-hand corner of the trail is the Stanley Draper Trail, the 13-mile trail. The one up towards the center of the map, the red one, that's the trail that goes along the Deep Fork. When we get the Deep Fork completed, we will almost have a complete loop around the city that you can bicycle on. From a recreational perspective, it also helps to connect some of our neighborhoods down through into the city as well. Some of the funding that we have, I want to try to get this out in front of you as well. Obviously, we have MAPS funding going into the Stanley Draper Trail. It did the Will Rogers Trail. It did the West River Trail. Some of the other funding that we have we have an impact fee now. Developers now, when they build new homes, build new subdivisions, they have to pay a per square foot fee that is broken down into new park fees and trail fees. So we are accumulating some amount of dollars annually through impact fees to go towards some of the activities that we will be discussing today and going forward. And of course, we have GEO bond money. The previous 2007, we still have some amount of money to spend from that. Those were specific. The 2017, when we built that GEO proposition that we all voted for back in September, we broadened the scope of that activity to include maintenance and signage. The previous 2007 GEO was specifically new trail construction. The 2017, we have the latitude to build new trails according to the path plan that you just heard about, that John explained, or to do maintenance, or to add amenities, or to add the sign programs. And I probably should have paid Eric or Debbie, a couple of bucks to do this presentation, because it's all about pavement. And since they did such a great job of educating you all on what their score system is, 70% being a pretty good road, 30% being no road at all, we're going to capitalize on that. We want our whole dialogue as it relates to the conditions of existing trails is based on what you've already learned through your roadways discussions. What is the PCI of our existing trail system? And if you can think about our 12-foot wide trails being either arterial trails or residential trails, then I think you'll be able to put it all into context as we go through this. We want to talk about the age of the existing, the current life expectancy, the type of defects, what is the rating, cost of repair per 1,000 linear feet. We're not going to get into mileage because that's too broad for a trail system. We're going to talk probably in increments of 1,000 feet. Type of the trail, what is the heaviest users? Is it mostly bikers? Is it mostly walkers? Is it a split configuration? Level of use, and then public input going forward. Again, pavement conditions, I want to reiterate that. We're going to focus on the PCI as it relates to the condition, and we'll talk about how we are getting to that on the trail system. For purposes of discussions, we picked our oldest multi-use trail, our heaviest used trail by a large variance of users. The high-speed bicyclists use the Burt Cooper Trail quite extensively for training. We have a lot of people that are getting out there and walking and jogging. We have mothers with strollers using this facility. So we wanted to go out there and do an analysis of the Burt Cooper Trail as it relates to the conditions of it. And as you've heard from Eric previously, you have streets, older streets, they're in pretty good shape. They don't really need a whole lot of work. But a few lane miles north or south or east or west, they might be in really, really bad shape, down into the 4s, 5s, and 6s that need to be rehabilitated. So we were trying to assess the criteriums by which we would evaluate the Burt Cooper Trail just as an exercise so that we can bring it forward, talk to you about those criteriums and how we got to those numbers, see if it makes sense for you all to evaluate our request for funding from this body to rehabilitate the trail systems. Again, just for exercise purposes, this is a portion of the Burt Cooper Trail at Lake Hefner. And you can see the segments are listed in there. You've got the pause points, the red dots that kind of make those 1,000-foot increments on there. You have the inset of the photographs. And if you look on there, you can see that those 4 segments are actually in relatively good shape. We got an 80 and an 8 and a 7, 80 percentile, 70 percentile. So this segment alone may only need a seal coating or a few crack fillings in this zone. We don't need to do an extensive repair to this existing site. But to give you an idea of how we get to these criteriums, we have used the Public Works machine that goes out and drives. It's actually driven the Burt Cooper Trail, so it's checked the variances there. We have done what we call the PACER evaluation. That's where we physically go out and visually look at the trail system. Are there cracks in there that a tire could get caught in that maybe the machine doesn't pick up that particular variance? But it all goes into that cohesive number that we create out of it. The Public Works scanner is a 40% weight. The physical eye on the pavement is a 40% weight in our scoring. The age of the pavement, we take that into consideration. That has a 10% coefficient. And then the material that it's made out of, concrete or asphalt, has another 10%. So that's how we get to the 100 percentile to get that 7-8 figure. Our research, again, working with Public Works' staff, a crack seal for those good sections that only need a minimal amount of work is about $6,000 a linear foot. And it will add 1 to 2 years to the life expectancy of the road, or of that trail. A seal coating, and again, that's a complete layer of new emulsions over the full 12-foot, over the full 1,000 linear feet, is approximately $14,000. $85,000. It should extend the life 4 to 8 years for that section of the trail. A mill and overlay is $211,000 for doing 1,000 feet, but it'll extend the life 8 to 10 years. And a complete restoration is $1 million, as John was talking about. If you got to take a section out, it's going to cost you quite a bit more money. It breaks down per year, and we could get into those factors going forward. We evaluated the approximately 9 miles of trail at the Burt Cooper system. And you can see we got 4 elements out there, and I had a picture of 3 of them up there that have a rating of 4. No maintenance is necessary whatsoever on the whole 9 miles of Burt Cooper. All the way down to, we have some sections that are ratings less than 6. They're down 5s, 4s. The majority of them are in the 25, so all we have to do is a little crack filling to, keep them from going any worse. But all told, for the 8.5 miles, 9 miles, is $250,000 to get our oldest trail system back into revitalized and safe use going forward. Again, we're just trying to get to what is a comfort zone to try to explain. I'm going through it quite quickly, but, to put it in context, the West River Trail that was done by MAPS, that's been open almost 3 years now, we should be going out there right now with a seal coating, just to keep that from deteriorating at all. We should probably do that probably on a 5 to 6 year rotation on all new trails. We should be out there giving it new life so that we get those 25 years out of those trail systems. We didn't do that with the first 70 miles of our trail system. So if you think about that, MAPS has added a little over 20 miles to our system. So you take that 20 from the 80, you got 60 miles of older trails that we have not done these type of life-extending activities to going forward. So, where do we start? How do we get to that point? We want to make sure that the investment we're making stays the investment, stays alive, and stays safe for our user groups. And we're getting a lot of complaints through the Trail Advisory Committee about the condition of our existing trails. Again, these are our, walk with me on this one. Okay. We're trying to figure out what's the best way to expend our dollars. You have $12 million of the tax funds. We have only $8 million in the 2017 GO. The 2017 GO, we have no projects slated at this point in time, probably for at least 3, maybe 4 years. So we're not going to have access to 2017 GO funds for a little while yet. We have an opportunity to attack some of these issues, whether it be $12 million worth of brand new trails in accordance with the Ped Path plan that you saw, a portion of that going into revitalizing our oldest trail systems, adding much-needed amenities, lighting, restrooms, shade trees, shade structures. Another component that we could attack is those connections to neighborhoods from our existing mainline trails. So maybe it's a half mile of new trail rather than a full mile. Again, it goes back to that whole conversation about sidewalks and walkability and mobility for our citizens. But again, these are some of the things that we need to think about as we go through this and get feedback from you all on how we should break that down going forward.
So again, $12 million for trails, and direction from the group on if you would like to consider allocating percentages of those funds to be dedicated to building new trails, new greenways, or doing projects on the existing trails system. That could further be broken down by just concentrating on existing trails and maintenance issues themselves, or adding amenities along trails, as Mr. Cupper presented to you, in terms of things like restroom facilities or, would you say, water fountains, drinking stations, signage. Those are some other types of things. So you could think about this in lots of different terms in terms of breaking up the $12 million to be allocated among all the needs across Oklahoma City. And with that, we would like direction, too, if you'd like to come up with some prioritization criteria that you would consider us going back and resorting lists by with the new and the existing needs.
And you guys, the Burt Cooper Trails, formerly known as the Lake Hefner Trails. I can tell you that the Trail Advisory Committee has been working on these matters for a long time, and The recommendation that they came up with are basically two. First, the resurfacing of the Burt Cooper trails, which are, I've ridden it a couple of times recently, it's dangerous. There are cracks in that trail that are 9 inches wide and 2 or 3 inches deep. And I'm not that good of a cyclist to negotiate those very well. That's our oldest trail. That trail, is what got everything started and let people realize the benefit of a multi-use trail. Their asphalt made. There's been improvements made, some through the years. Initially, there was no French drains on the east side of those trails, and water was collecting, so you would have an algae growth, which made it extremely dangerous. They went back, and Parks and Recreation went in and did French drains on the east side, so unless we have a huge flood, they go away. But if you're talking about $250,000 to bring that trail back up to safe category, Doug, is that correct?
That's what our estimates show at this point in time, yes, sir.
Well, that was one of the priorities the Trail Advisory Group came up with, and then also is the signage package. Oh, watch your microphone. And we've done a feasibility study, but no signage have gone in on all our trails. And if you look at a city this size and a trail system, the one great thing that's lacking on all the trails is the wayfinding and safety and etiquette signage. And that's the other thing that the Trail Advisory Committee suggested doing with our dollars. And we're talking this group, this is $12 million that we will have in our 27-month sales tax extension. The GO bond is unfortunately only $8 million, but that's 3 or 4 years out before we'll see any benefit from that.
I might also mention that the bike walk plan is primarily recommending connections for new trail systems, but there is one trail system, which is the Lake Hefner Trail System, which it did prioritize enhancements to that at the very top of the list. So both Bike Walk OKC and the work that the Trails Advisory Committee have done have noted that the Lake Hefner Trail, with the number of users and what other types of things it draws to the use of the park as a whole, is a high priority for our city and our citizens.
We're talking visitations in the millions to the Burt Cooper Lake Hefner Trail System. Just to give you a correlation, Martin Park Nature Park receives 450,000 visitors to it. Burt Cooper Trail is busier than Martin Park. So just to give you a correlation, it hits those numbers, those magic numbers of users. Yeah, it's not really connected to neighborhoods per se. Pretty close, but it doesn't go through neighborhoods like the Will Rogers or some of the other trails. It's kind of if I had to put it into a context that you've already learned, arterial street or residential street, the Burt Cooper would be pretty much one of our oldest residential streets in the city because it's kind of enclosed within one element of the city. So being the oldest, we thought it'd be reach that priority level as being an important factor for you all to consider.
It would seem to me that making sure that what we had, and before we go further, was really of the highest quality and the safest would be a criteria that would seem logical to follow. And then incrementally, as we continue on, build something of like stature, rather than make it bigger, make it better, and then build better later on.
Yeah, I was going to suggest, how far along are you guys? And that is the assessment you've done on the Cooper Trail is really helpful. How far along are you on assessing that?
We've got the next 3 oldest trails are under review now. We're making sure that we have access to the Public Works' equipment to be able to drive to get those data points through that means. Staff is already doing their site visitations to visually assess those trails. So we will be able to bring those kind of data points back to you all. We just don't know how far we want to, again, kind of like what John was saying, until we were able to talk to you about what all of the issues are and get your feedback on how to set those limits or those percentages or those priorities. we're working towards it because we'll need it when the GO bond does finally come around. We're going to have those metrics in place. So we have been working towards those things.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Mr. Johnson. One, I'm a fan of the Hefner Trail because, that's the first trail I've ever interacted with in Oklahoma City as well. So I'd probably second those comments from others. I think that makes a lot of sense. So I think because of where you guys are in assessing, and I think and as helpful as that information is, and knowing that it's $250,000, for example, to repair for those repairs, it may make sense to look at some prioritization on you all's end as far as where you got some information. Kind of like what we did initially with those first 16 projects. Like if there are maybe a top 2 or 3 existing projects where you do have some ideas of the cost, at least from my perspective, it seems like cost would help to understand, and maybe there's something that we can get started sooner than later, because you brought up the Cooper Trail and maybe one other where there is some maintenance that would help to extend the life. So if we know that those things are out there, I would be a fan of considering some of that in regards to what's existing while we're trying to figure out sort of the broader needs overall, especially if that's going to take more time. Maybe there are 2 or 3 things that we could all pretty much say, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And then you can give us some more information where we could make a better determination on new versus existing or greenways, et cetera. Because I do feel like understanding the cost helps. And I know that the fact we know that there's the 1.1 million per mile is also a helpful metric because we kind of know what that new infrastructure would cost.
It's easy to do the math. It's about 12 miles of new trail.
Right. Yeah. But having a better handle on the existing would help. And if that's going to take some time, maybe prioritizing the things that would be easier to figure out, feels like we could maybe get something going sooner than later.
Well, that's what we were hoping to be able to establish with y'all. And again, we're trying to do in vernacular that you've already embraced and learned through public works efforts as it relates to streets and roadways. So appreciate it.
May I ask one question? Of other outside funding sources, which would they be more likely to fund, new or existing? Because I think it might be wise for us to focus on what might not be funded from other potential sources.
That's a good point. Obviously, if we get federal highway grants, it's all about new construction, and we do have access to those. I think I failed to mention that we already have some federal dollars coming in for new trail construction. The GO bond, the 2017 GO bond, the proposition for trails was written in such a way that it was broad enough for you, the voters, to evaluate. We included maintenance dollars into that. We could spend the whole $8 million on just maintenance. We included amenities. We included restrooms and shade structures, and a sign package for the whole trail system is included in that bond language, as well as new construction. So again, we could spend the whole $8 million on 8 lane miles of new construction. The impact fees is also a little more general. The impact fees that we're collecting from developers, we could build new trails with those funds, but the money comes in at a slow rate that it'd be more likely that we would go into those geographical areas set within the impact zones and rehabilitate trails. So we could add amenities, we could rehabilitate some small sections of the existing trail systems that touch those zones through the impact fees.
Common sense seems that the 2 priorities of resurfacing and reworking the trails, the Burt Cooper trails, and doing the signage, which would cover every district in the city, are 2 things that I would love to see as an action item that we can vote on in the next meeting possibly, that would also entail what dollars are being looked at, because those are both immediate need situations. And as committee has talked about, it's similar to what we've done on the streets, is let's go ahead and get going. The conditions in both the signage and the conditions of the Burt Cooper Trail are only going to get worse, unfortunately.
Well, I'll work with Aubrey and her staff to try to bring the presentation from the sign package perspective forward to you all so you can see how robust, how complete that is, and then we could go from there on that. We'll see what we can do about creating the next agenda, again, working with Aubrey.
Happy to do that.
Great. Any other comments? And on the signage situation, that basically means that it's the feasibility study that's been done, and I think now the engineering is complete on that.
It's getting close.
Getting close to being complete. That will be uniform on all the trails. It'll be the same information basically, although each trail, of course, is unique to itself, but it doesn't have to be reinvented. It's going to be a good quality situation that, again, from the standpoint of public safety, I think is greatly needed.
Thank you all.
Doug Hooper. Thank you. Next item. I wish we could get Cliff Notes on some of this stuff. Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is going to be an action item for consideration today, and I think one of the things that we've really worked diligently this past spring was to bring all these items to you to this point where we start talking about the implementation plan. And so instead of bringing items in pieces, this is really going to combine all those thoughts and all those items that we've previously either discussed, received, or approved. And so you should have received and you should have in front of you actually one of these booklets. This is the actual implementation plan. And as we've previously discussed, it's got a little bit of room in it because the intent is that we're going to be adding additional projects to this about every 6 months. But what you're going to find in here and what I'm going to go over in just a couple of short minutes and can answer questions is what's included in this today. So you've got one of these to take with, and then we're also going to make sure that we make this available online at OKC.gov, but we'll first want to get the council's approval. So you've got your copies early. When we talk about the implementation plan, and again, we began work on this from a staff's level from day one. There's been a lot of hard work from planning staff, from public works staff. We have also started working very closely with the financial pieces to integrate all of those, and that's really a part of good implementation, is making sure that the budget, the scope, and then, of course, the schedule, the timelines are all coordinated. The good news up to this point is we're not able to officially give you a timeline, but it hasn't stopped us from proceeding. And so looking at this plan, these are the 8 major sections. You're going to find there's an executive summary. Then you're going to find that there's the 5 project sections, beginning with the street resurfacing, street enhancements, sidewalk, trails, and bicycle infrastructure. We left a category in as Category 7 for future project updates and the appendix. And these are identified with the major tabs. And so if you're looking to jump to just one of those particular items, just follow that in the order of the tabs that you find in the book itself. When we look at the executive summary, and I'm just going to break these down by each section very quickly, it just gives you a history of the Better Streets, Safer City initiative, talks a little bit about the tax. This is also the first place where we've actually published the funding wheel that shows those allocations, many which came up today as how much each of those 5 project allocations are. Street resurfacing at $168 million, street enhancements at $24, sidewalks at $24 million, trails at $12, and bicycle infrastructure at $12 million. It also talks about the establishment of this advisory board. It also reminds those that the collection started January 1st. And then on this last page, this is where we talk about the departmental coordination with the various departments that are at work, getting ready to implement these projects, and then also the projects themselves, this implementation plan, and the board. When we look at the street resurfacing, so again, if you flip open to that tab, you're going to find that it's in sections. You're going to find that there's actually a subdivider sheet that's in there that break these down. The early start projects are in the plan. These are those original 16 projects valued at $18.9 million. These are the individual project worksheets that you'll find for each of those, and you're also going to find that there is a coordinated map as well. So these are all those items that we had previously received. Also included in what we did at the very beginning of the meeting is in the 41 arterial projects valued at $22.1 million, and also the 3 residential projects at $13.8. So you'll find, again, project worksheets for each of those, and then you'll find corresponding maps as well. And I think you'll find they're very geographically diverse. We've been able to address most areas of the city in the streets projects to date. So to date, with your recommendation for approval, we'll have 60 projects valued at nearly $55 million moving forward. This is enough scope for city staff to actually use sales taxes that are collected for this first 6 months in the program. We move to the street enhancements. Now, these next 4 tabs are actually very light. There's actually nothing in them. When you flip open to your book, this is what you're working on today. So as those projects are developed and as recommendations are made, whether you look at street enhancements, that's going to, of course, include all those things that we've talked about, a mix of improvements for pedestrians, transit, automobile, and bicycle users. And again, the project worksheets will follow just as soon as we're able to receive and approve those here at the advisory board and the city council level. Most likely, if we do end up where we need to approve some early start projects as possibly requested today, we can do that before we get to that 6-month time frame for the update. So staff will be prepared to do so if this board is ready. But for now, there aren't any worksheets in street enhancements. The sidewalks also do not have any worksheets yet since we're continuing to work on those. And again, we've had a pretty lengthy discussion today of the type of projects that would be included in sidewalks. Same would be for trails, the conversation that we're just ending. And then the last is the bicycle infrastructure, much what Mr. Tankard had outlined today. As those decisions are made, additional project worksheets will come in. Once those project worksheets are ready and approved, that's where staff will actually start working very diligently to get all that work underway and into the field. This is going to be a section called Project Updates, and we really have just proposed that this is going to be where we can insert those updates periodically, whether they're semi-annual or annual updates. This is also where we propose that once we develop a timeline where all of the projects are integrated, where you'd find the program timeline. So we're picturing something that looks a little bit like a Gantt chart, something that shows the length of time that it'll take to do the street projects, when they start and finish, and again, for the trails, bicycle, sidewalk, and streetscapes. That'll be something that we forecast here in this next amendment. And then lastly are the appendices. Now, much of this was documentation that was handed out previously at either the workshop. There's also the booklet that I noticed a few of you brought with you today that has some of that. This also has that background information. Again, trying to keep it all together in one source so that if you had the implementation plan but you hadn't been at the workshop, or if you're possibly a resident that's just wanting to know more, you'll be able to find that very easily at okc.gov once this document's approved. So the ordinance is in here, the advisory board resolution, and then again, we're looking at financial summaries as well. So that's where we're at today. Next steps are with your recommendation for approval, and this is an action item that's on your agenda, so we are seeking action to adopt the resolution. We would be placing this on the next available city council meeting for their approval, and upon approval, we will officially then have all these projects moving forward. I will update, and I'll just go ahead and update now. I was going to leave this for the director's report. We have already initiated the 16 early start projects. Those were previously approved by the council, although they're also included here. We've also written the work orders to the contractors starting on all of those. The funds are here and allowing us to move those very quickly forward as early start. So with that, I can answer any questions you might have about the current plan.
I do.
Michael?
And I know finance was supposed to report to us later, but talking about early start for a trail, Lake Hefner was discussed. It's in a red zone. It's on number 2 on the list. Where are we for dollars in those silos if we were to include that in this recommended?
So I'm going to jump a little bit ahead to the next agenda item, which is the revenue and expenditure report. And I think what you're going to find is, as of April 23rd, we've actually had collections that easily account for all the funding for the approvals in the short term or for the early starts. As we continue to receive about $10 million on average a month in sales tax collections, we would forecast that there would be ample funding available this summer to proceed with additional projects if that's the guide or the desire of the advisory board. So monies are now coming in at a rate monthly for us to start adding additional projects to the program, early start or actually just projects.
And my ask to the board would be what was presented as far as the Burt Cooper estimate of needs to get it up and running, and the fact that it is on the map and it is red. I was just going to ask if that be an early start for trails out of that particular silo of monies to be included in this recommended items to the City Council. Oh, okay.
So I think
that's going to be a recommended agenda item for me.
So today's discussion was our recommendation to staff on how you want them to proceed with that prioritization, and then bring it back.
They'll bring it back.
The next meeting for a vote of whether or not you want to early
Okay, well, I'm going to ask that be on the agenda.
Okay. And staff's prepared to do those particular items. That's the reason we're taking so much feedback from you. So I think from what you've heard from Doug Cupper and Aubrey is as they work together, we can bring some things back for consideration.
And we might want to bring you some numbers on that. The bike walk plans, enhancements to Lake Hefner are beyond just the repair of the trail itself. The number that Mr. Cupper presented to you, the $254,000, would be to do the improvements to the trail surface. So if you'd like to see what the bike walk plan is recommending in terms of enhancements to Lake Hefner as well, that might be something you'd want to consider for early start.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to have as much information based on, I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of thought in that one in particular, so we can bring that, and then we'll be in a good position to be able to get some guidance and likely get something going.
And I would suggest this, I even have it on this slide, but if we find that we need to do an implementation plan amendment before the 6 months, I mean, there isn't anything that precludes us from bringing that earlier. So if we have advancement on, say, some early start or some other projects that are ready to go, instead of waiting that full period of time, we can absolutely bring those back for you before then. This was just a real ballpark kind of item, just to give you guidance. This is, we're not approving all the projects at once. We're going to do these in increments all the way through the life of the program.
Yeah, that was my actual next question. I think, and you kind of hit on it, but it's about kind of the form and process. So it sounds like today we will be adopting this resolution and adopting the plan, but the plan itself is conceived as a working document. So as we deliberate on projects, or if we want to accelerate projects or adjust those criteria, that's a matter of process within these meetings, right? All right, I would say, as another aside, I appreciate the way you guys have gone back to recompile this information. I mean, the way you've mapped the project documents to the maps and things like that was really helpful for me in reviewing to get ready for the meeting today. So I appreciate that.
You're welcome. The other thing that we're working on for online use, obviously the book will be updated, is an interactive map that we hope to be able to provide that will be under the Better Street, Safer City initiatives on the city's website, that will be all the mapping that you've seen that are not necessarily the bond or a previous bond program or even the MAPS program. So we're starting to build that information now. I would hope that we'd have that available this summer too. So again, we're looking for an action item today, Mr. Chairman, on the implementation plan.
I would move that we approve the resolution.
It's been moved and seconded to adopt this implementation plan. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Thank you. And next is to receive the financial reports.
Yeah, good morning, committee members. My name is Doug Dowler. I'm the budget director for the City of Oklahoma City, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the finances for the Better Street, Safer City sales tax. The report that you have is a snapshot as of April 23rd of where things stand. And so you can see revenues for April came in at $8.4 million to raise the total to $20.4 million in tax received so far. You'll notice that the April amount was significantly below what we expected, and the reason behind that, a couple of things. First was, last year when we were putting together our projections for the Better Street, Safer City tax, we did those in March. And we expected April to come in at a reasonable level, and it actually came in pretty far below that on our sales tax. So when we're looking at what we've got to grow off of, we needed pretty significant growth to hit that target, because we didn't know it was going to fall that far. So you'll see that it's below target by about $400,000. We've got in the preliminary numbers for May. We're well above May. We're going to be, everything is fine. It's just really April was kind of an anomaly because we had such a steep decline last April when we were in the middle of our recession. We had a bigger hill to climb for April. You'll see when we look at expenditures, we've added on here current allocations. That's out of our financial system, PeopleSoft. That's where we can set aside funds for the specific projects. And again, saying that this was a snapshot as of April 23rd, we had $14.6 million allocated to specific projects. If you were to look in our PeopleSoft system today, it shows the $18.9 million that's been allocated to the early start projects. Those 16 projects are all in there. So this was kind of part way. They'd been working their way, making the work orders, the purchase orders for that work, and so that's in there. You'll see that we have a column in here for expenditures. Nothing has been expended yet. We haven't written any checks yet to the vendors, but we do have money, what we call encumbered, or it's obligated. We've written a work order. We've written a purchase order. that's something we can add on to this report if you think that would be helpful, or if you just want to keep track of just what's been spent, how many dollars have left, that's what we've got on there now. So as of today, nothing has been spent, but these contractors have been directed to begin work, and that project is obligated there. So that's kind of a quick overview of where things are from the finances. Be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you, sir. This is an action item. We need to vote on this.
Move to approve. I move to approve.
Been moved, and, I'm sorry.
I had
I'm
further
sorry.
discussion. I'm sorry.
No problem. Sorry.
I'm sorry. On the financial summary, that's what you're discussing here. I don't see the 18.9 you discussed. I'm sorry.
So as I said, this was as of April 23rd, so we took a snapshot from our financial system. At that point, it was $14,609,000. They were in the process of issuing work orders and getting things allocated to those projects. So it was partway done at that point on April 23rd. If you look today, if I were to update this as of today, it would say 18.9 there on that under current allocations for street resurfacing.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
It's a workshop.
Did that answer all your questions? Is there any other questions or discussion? Okay, it has been moved and seconded to approve this. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Thank you. Next item is director reports. Have we done that? Good. Next items are comments from the board.
I have something to commend you. Thank you. I asked a couple of months ago to have the ward added for street projects, and I wanted to thank you for that.
I do think it's good to mention, I think, considering the square mileage of Oklahoma City and all that you have to say grace over, it seems to me like we are part of a very well-run city. Thank you all.
Will we have on the question on next meeting, would we have action items on the Burt Cooper resurfacing and the signage package? Would those be two separate action items?
We will bring back the cost estimates. I'm speaking on behalf of the Parks Department. They let me know they would bring back the signage cost estimates and the evaluation of the existing trails so that you can kind of see that information. And if you would like to go ahead and make a recommendation to move some priority projects up the list, we could include that as a separate action item. Okay. Is that the direction you're giving us today?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We will certainly do that.
Very good. Any other comments? Comments from staff? Comments from citizens? Wonderful. Appreciate everyone's time and all the energy that's gone into this meeting. We're adjourned. Thank you.